Hi, and welcome to TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers, a program of educators worldwide. I'm your host today, Melanie Gobert.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Gobert, your host for today's episode of TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers, a program of educators worldwide. Joining us today is David Knott. He's a senior instructor in the Achievement Academy Bridge program at the American University in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Today, he's going to be talking to us about students' digital competence. So thank you for coming, David.
Thanks for having me.
Now, tell me, what do you mean exactly by students' digital competence?
So what we're talking about when we say digital competence is, particularly in our context, it's regarding their fluency with technology in an academic setting. So as we all know, they're very, very competent when it comes to using their mobile phones, social media, whether it's videos, gaming, and that sort of stuff. And the research shows that as well, that they greatly favor that aspect of using technology, but it's to the detriment of using it in a more formal setting or an academic setting, which has serious implications for their learning.
Okay, well, I'm assuming that you mean using things like Word and using things like the library's database and stuff like that when you talk about academic digital tools.
I am, but I'm also just talking in general using a browser or using a laptop compared to using a mobile phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they organize their files or even just name their documents, and how much they actually focus on the need to be consistent or correct when it comes to that sort of thing.
But it seems to me that, maybe what's happening is that these things that we traditionally regarded as important in an academic learning environment, using these types of tools, may be replaced by other tools in the future, and the students won't need to know how to use those tools, especially in the age of AI, if I'm making sense.
Oh, making perfect sense. And certainly, and you see a lot more teachers involving students in their mobile phones, and now that we're becoming more accepting of AI and that sort of thing. But stuff like using a laptop and using Word or PowerPoint or emailing and that sort of thing, it's not going away in the next 6 months. And so it's really important that they are able to use those tools because they're going to need them for the rest of their academic career. And certainly in the near future, when they become professionals and they get out into the working world, they're going to have to become more proficient with using those sorts of tools as well.
Okay, can you shed some light on what the literature says regarding young people's academic technology proficiency? What does the literature say?
So basically what the research shows us is that, as we've already kind of touched upon, young people use technology for identity formation, right? So a lot of communicating, like we said, social media, for the boys, more often for gaming and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to using technology for their schoolwork, the amount of time they spend on it and the amount of importance they put on it, it's a lot lower. And so what that means is that when they get into university, and this is the context I'm speaking from, is in a university setting, is that their competence with technology that we expect them to have is actually a lot lower. And so even the students themselves, based on what they see around the university, the research has shown that they even rank themselves quite low. So even though we assume that, yes, they always have technology around them and they're fluent in the way they move from one app to another, It's true in certain aspects, but not necessarily in what we need them to be functional and competent in.
Well, as we talk about this, I mean, I have heard stories even from, fellow Western teachers that their 17-year-old son had never sent an email before when he was applying for colleges, so he didn't know how to send one. But it seems to me that some of these things are quickly being replaced by things like WhatsApp. I mean, discussion board forums used to be a very popular thing, right? But I don't know anyone who uses them anymore. It's probably being replaced by podcasts.
It certainly could be. And like I said, so I think that's why you do see a lot of teachers shifting towards using things like social media and allowing mobile phones and that sort of stuff. On the other hand, a lot of the stuff that we need to teach as English teachers, whether it be writing or reading and that sort of stuff, they need to be able to use a lot of this technology. I mean, it's very hard to write and submit an essay unless you can use Word. Now it may get replaced by something, well into the future, but it's not going away right away. I mean, when I'm talking about technology in class, I am also just talking about using different apps on the internet, right? It's like our learning management systems, your iLearns or your Blackboards or your Moodles and things like that. And a lot of students, they're just not even familiar with that or how they can navigate it. So when I'm talking about facilitating it, I mean, not necessarily forcing them to use the technology that I thought was important 10 years ago, but being able to navigate the sorts of sites and apps that they need to be able to be successful and learn now, right, in our program and then beyond, in the next 3 or 4 years at the university.
Now, as you mentioned that, I'm also thinking about the kinds of ways that I see young people using technology, using WhatsApp, using Instagram. And then I'm thinking about the learning management system. So even I think 15 years ago or something like that, when I did my doctorate degree, I had to learn how to use the learning management system. And I think there were a few videos about it. It wasn't that challenging. But looking back to 3 years ago, the last time I taught, those platforms seem extremely clunky and slow moving to me. I mean, what does your university, and universities don't seem to want to keep investing, or even these platforms used to be like competitive against each other. Now they're all owned more and more by one thing. And you have to admit, they do seem rather clunky. If you
Yes,
see
I understand exactly what you're saying.
Online shop now versus the learning management system at your university.
Sure. I mean, they're improving, and I agree. A lot of them are still quite antiquated in the way that, say, for instance, the interface, right? It's a lot of the same traditional sorts of buttons and things like that. And again, I think that that's something that we will get to eventually, and it will keep improving until it's eventually replaced by something else. And certainly that would be AI driven. But just as you said, for you, it wasn't that hard to adjust to it. And I think that in some way, it ironically kind of suits in the whole narrative of digital immigrants and digital natives, right? Our students are usually considered digital natives, right? Because they're supposed to be so fluent moving through technology. And we are digital immigrants because we didn't grow up typing on a computer or something like that, right? We grew up, well, I learned to type on a typewriter. And so I think we basically, I think we adjust better at our stage to at least the current tools. And so when I'm talking about learning management system, for instance, with my students, I make sure I record a video before the semester starts so that they know how to interact with it. And they know once I send them that link, here's the tabs that they go to. And I demonstrate on that video, and you click on this, and that's how you get to the syllabus. And then you download that and save it in a particular folder. And those are some of the sorts of things that at least my students, in my experience, and the literature has pointed to that they need a bit of help with.
Okay, and you also mentioned when to use technology in class or not. What are your ideas about that?
I mean, basically, because there are so many tools out there and there are so many apps, and we do get a lot of these kind of flashing lights, and people want, try this website and try that website and everything else. We really need to reflect beforehand. Is it something that the students really need, right? Is it really going to benefit them, right? Is it coming from other interest? For instance, the institution interest, right? Are they trying to promote technology, not necessarily for the benefit of the students? I mean, one of the things that my students talk about, or did talk about last semester, was a sort of tech overload. And, we kind of compiled a list of all the different apps that they were using. And it's understandable, it's a lot. And so we need to make sure that if we're going to introduce something, whether it's an app or a website or something to that effect, that there's a real need for it, and it can't be supplanted by something else that we've already been using, and you can just continue to use it rather than go for the newest, flashiest kind of kid on the block, I guess.
And you also mentioned monitoring. What do you mean by that? How do you monitor your students' use of digital technology?
So when I'm talking about that, as far as what we use in class, I mean, there's just the traditional monitoring. And I mean, I walk around, and rather than just look at their language use, I will look and see how did they save that particular document. Because as I said, that's one of the things that in my experience, they have trouble with, being consistent and not just putting it on the desktop or not just putting it in the downloads folder. And so they have a folder dedicated to that class, and they're saving it based on that kind of that name that I've required them to write that document, as well as just other sorts of things that say are instruction checking questions. And I might put a Microsoft Word up on the screen and ask them, where is a certain task, how do they change the font, et cetera, and so they can contribute in that way. One of my favorite things to do is just an exit ticket. And so I don't let them leave the class until they've done a particular thing on technology. So, for instance, looking at their feedback on an essay, because again, it's been something, it's not, I agree, it's 100% clunkier than it should be for them to navigate and find where their feedback is. And so that's the task they have to accomplish before they can leave the classroom, right? And they have to show me, here's my feedback, there's the rubric, I can see your notes. Say, okay, great, now go home and look at it and go on, as opposed to I didn't know where that feedback was, because that's a pretty common issue that I've seen.
Yeah, you brought up some interesting points. I think also, I mean, I'm reflecting over my career teaching, and 20 years ago, we were teaching students, you have to name the document, you have to save it, this is how you make a folder. And there was a specific course taught on information technology, but those courses seem to have disappeared, not credit bearing enough or whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, where is the slack going to be taken up? It has to be taken up by content teachers, right?
Right. And so that's what I've been trying to do, and hopefully push them a little bit better, whether it is, using the LMS or sending properly formatted, respectful emails, or other sorts of
Putting a
things.
subject in the email.
With a subject, yes, exactly, with a formal greeting, for instance, and signing their name, right? So it is something that, as English teachers, yeah, we do end up having to pick up some of that slack, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's worth it, right? Because they'll benefit, whether it is even just their study skills and things like that, if we emphasize it a bit more in our classes.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, David, on this episode of TTELT, and reminding us of how important it is to teach students some digital literacy skills, digital competency skills that they might be missing, such as saving Word documents with a name and making folders to store everything from one class. I think it's easy for us to forget that they might not have learned that in their K-12 education. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks again for having me. It's been fun.
Okay, this has been your host, Melanie Gobert, for today's episode of TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers, a program brought to you by educators worldwide.
Thank you for joining us today. Share with us how you are using these tips. Leave us a comment or voice message on social media or at ttelt.org. Thanks for joining this episode of TTELT, brought to you by educators worldwide. Follow, like, and subscribe to TTELT on your social media, and try a new teaching tip today.